Hello everyone, welcome back to another talk. It's been a while since I've recorded. I apologize, my grandfather passed away earlier this month and I needed time to get myself together. But with that being said, today I want to talk about something very interesting that I see occasionally crop up that I think really needs correcting. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about crime and the modern day and general feelings of safety, specifically in America, but generally in first world countries, a lot of people say, oh, things are getting better. And yet, on the other hand, people consistently respond when asked that they feel like the world is getting more dangerous. I think the best summary of this sort of debate is in an interview Neil deGrasse Tyson had, where he was talking about how for the past 30 years, people have, in all but 2 or 3 of these years, expressed that the previous year was safer. In other words, people in the past 30 years, almost every time, stated that the current year that they were asked was more dangerous than the previous year. And he goes on to say that this is wrong because if you look at the crime statistics, crime has been going down. But Neil deGrasse Tyson and other people who espouse this idea are only half correct here. Okay, there are a couple of factors that are really not being considered when people talk about crime. First off, the world isn't getting more dangerous, but it's also not getting any safer. It's sort of maintaining the levels of danger, so to speak. It's just that the crimes are changing. The crimes being performed are changing, and they're evolving in ways that make them a little more difficult to track. A little more difficult to provide to the public, right? Let me talk about some examples. Let's talk about theft first, right? 30 years ago, say, theft, let's actually stick with 30 years pretty specifically. 30 years ago, theft was somebody stealing your wallet, someone breaking into your house and stealing your jewelry and your TV. Things like that, right? You would pretty conceivably lose several thousands in a burglary, or if your wallet was stolen. But if your wallet's stolen, what's the real concern here is your identity, right? You've got your ID in there most times. You've got your bank card, your credit card, what have you. Nowadays, instead of theft, we have frauds and scams massively on the rise, which YouTube has only been talking about for a couple of years because YouTube creators are a little more outside of the box thinkers than, say, the government is. That's not the government's fault. I'll get into that in a second. But you see a lot more frauds and scams, and these can wipe out millions, right? The whole Save the Kids thing, right? That whole debacle, among other cryptocurrencies that were just scams. You have fake Kickstarters or fake GoFundMes that are actually scams but are presented in a way that makes them not look like scams, so people donate and then the person just takes it and runs, right? You've got that. You've got false charities. Save the Kids could qualify as a false charity, I guess. And other things like that, right? You've got all of these new ways to steal people's money through frauds and scams that are significantly more harmful than the average burglary, or most burglaries, in fact. Yes, theft as tracked by the government has declined. This is true. But that's because anybody who knows what they're doing isn't going to steal physical objects. That's really not worth it, unless you're stealing a wallet specifically to take someone's identity and sell that. But even then, that's not as good as creating a scam, a fake cryptocurrency, a fake charity, whatever, and fooling people into giving you thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions if you can get a large enough hype train going, right? To the moon, crypto bros. Right? Boom! Suddenly you've made tens to hundreds of thousands, maybe even a couple million, and now it's up to the government to prove that what you did was a scam and not a misunderstanding, an accident, I had the best intentions. Kind of the arguments that that some media places are making for Sam Bankman-Fried. Same thing, right? The problem here is that frauds and scams are really, really hard to track. Because they're quite a bit more difficult to prove conclusively that they're scams. One really interesting example is Chronicles of Illyria, which was a MMO Kickstarter, I think it was Kickstarter, project, and it failed. And various people, it's actually become quite the interesting debate, where some people claim it was a scam the whole time, some people claim it became a scam after it became clear to the creator of the Kickstarter that it was not going to work, and some people just continue to claim that he fully intended to release the game, but underestimated the amount of work or overestimated his ability to do it, right? Regardless, if you look into Chronicles of Illyria, there's a whole bunch of videos about it on YouTube. It's very easy to find out about. You look into it, and it becomes a matter of your opinion on whether or not that's a scam or if it was just a failure, right? Scams can be hard to prove. That's one of the really big deals for the FTX case, right? That is more going to be about proving that he maliciously and intentionally misapplied funds for his own and others' benefits, or did he just make mistakes? Because that's going to be the difference there, and that's why some media continue to try to claim that, oh, he's just misunderstood, he just made mistakes, he's just a silly guy. That's why a lot of his interviews, he really harps on, oh, I was stupid, I made this mistake and everything. That's why, right? I don't personally believe it, but that's just me. But proving scams and frauds is a lot more difficult than proving theft, right? Because obviously with a physical object, if you're in possession of a physical object that doesn't belong to you, guess what? And that's why, right? So it's not so much that theft is going down. Theft is just evolving to online, to scams and frauds, convincing you to part with your money willingly under some sort of false pretense. And again, that's much harder to track because it's much harder to prove. The same thing can be said with violent crimes, right? Technically, theft can be a violent crime given the circumstances, depending on the circumstances, but in terms of violent crimes, we're talking assaults and murders. These are going down, yes, that is absolutely true. But on the other hand, when violent crimes are committed, they're affecting more people. Take, for instance, murders. Murders are going down, sure, yeah. But then the number of mass killings is going up. So, on the one hand, sure, murders are going down, but mass violence is going up. Assaults are just going down in general, right? But absolutely, we have again, we have an evolution. We're going from individual murders to mass killings. And mass killings can be a bit interesting to track, because what qualifies as a mass killing, and that's going to depend on definition. Is it a certain number of people? Is it an attempt on a certain number of people? Does it, require specific weapons? You can adjust this. Are you going to just qualify these as regular murders, or is this going to be a separate crime of a mass killing attempt, right? We don't really have a whole lot of definition here at this point in time. And that's, a bit of a different... Because if you ask two different people how many mass killings there have been in the past, say, 5 years, they're going to, unless they're operating on the same definition of mass killing, they're going to give you two different numbers. Okay? Again, murder is evolving. And then we also have various other crimes that are evolving as well. A lot of people, of course, talk about sexual assaults and stuff, but sex-based crimes are evolving as well, because before the internet, there had to be a physical element present, but that's no longer the case. Child grooming has really gone up in the internet age because of the ease of access to children, and messaging children in secret without parents knowing or friends knowing or whatever. And blackmail is becoming easier to pull off for similar reasons. Blackmail is a lot easier to manage because now you can generate evidence over the internet. You can say the old, I believe the popular term is the loverboy blackmail, right? Not even the loverboy method like Andrew Tate uses. I'm talking about like pretending to be one person and getting compromising photos from someone and then turning around and trying to blackmail them with that, which we hear about quite often. These kinds of crimes are all evolving, but they're also a lot more difficult to track because people don't report these as often, just like the problem we have with rape, where not everyone is going to report that, right? Rape is extremely underreported. It's very similar with other sex crimes. They're very much underreported because there's the shame, there's the ease of access again. There's the fear that this will affect their lives if they do report it, right? So these kinds of crimes are, first off, more prolific than people understand or even think about. And second, they're also evolving. They're becoming easier to pull off, they're becoming more widespread, and they're becoming more severe. Right? The world isn't becoming more dangerous. This is true. But crime isn't really going down. The crimes we track and release as stats are going down. But that's because we're not accurately able to track the evolution of these crimes. Another common talking point in, oh, the world is safer, is that wars are less dangerous. And this is a bit of a misstatement. On the one hand, fewer soldiers die in military or military-esque conflicts. This is true, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson, again going back to that interview, mentions that in the world wars, thousands of people were dying an hour, a day, a week. And in the world wars, you had people facing off against each other with guns and tanks and other vehicles. There were tens of thousands of men on each side shooting at each other. But nowadays, we have fewer people with better equipment, and we've got drones, we've got better missiles than they had in the world wars, to take the most recent conflict of Israel versus Hamas, Hamas launched a surprise attack with missiles. Right? These missiles were better than the missiles, obviously, that we had in World War II. And think about the damage a bullet can do compared to the damage a missile can do. Right? When a bullet impacts something, it's just damaging that one thing. When a missile impacts something, the missile explodes and hits multiple things. A single bullet isn't going to damage the structural integrity of a building enough to make that building potentially collapse, or a couple of missiles, for maybe a missile or two later to make it collapse. A bullet is not going to do that. A full clip isn't going to do that. Right? So, on the one hand, our weapons are getting more dangerous for military conflicts, but on the other hand, we have fewer people on the field. But what's also happening that we don't really talk about is civilian casualties. And see, the interesting thing about the world wars is that civilian casualties primarily happened in specific contexts, usually bombing runs. London in World War II, in the early to mid part of World War II, all of the famous or the infamous bombing runs where they would have the air raid sirens. The benefit there was that at the very least, England got some forewarning. They had radar, they had watchmen who would look for bombers, and then when they detected an air raid, they would obviously trigger the siren, everyone would go into a shelter and mitigate civilian casualties. And a lot of cities had some kind of method like this. So only really cities that had significant bombing runs really done on them extensively had severe civilian casualties. Of course, Japan had massive numbers when America nuked them twice. But in terms of regular military conflicts, there were fewer civilian casualties. There still were, but they were fewer. For example, when France surrendered in World War II, their army had been defeated outside of Paris, right? So when the Germans marched in a couple of days later into Paris, there were significantly fewer civilian casualties because they didn't fight in the city, they didn't bomb the city, they didn't do any of that, right? They didn't need to. Paris knew that their army had been defeated and surrendered accordingly. And even when you factor in the bombing runs and everything, those bombs were, again, comparatively primitive to what we've got now. You had duds that would occasionally drop. That would have to be, dismantled by professionals. You would have misses and things like that. Nowadays, we've got better tracking. We've got electronic tracking. We have larger missiles that explode more consistently. When Hamas launched its initial attack on Israel, it just launched tons and tons of missiles. Israel didn't know. And people didn't have much time to take cover from the first salvo, right? A lot of civilian casualties right off the top. So on the one hand, sure, yeah, we have fewer soldiers getting killed in the field. That's true. Absolutely. But the potential for civilian casualties is higher, and we're seeing more civilian casualties than I think a lot of people would really expect. I mean, look at the Ukraine-Russia war, and how many civilian casualties are there. To some extent, you could actually claim that a certain amount of the people fighting for Ukraine are civilians. They don't exactly have a massive standing army. War is evolving, just like crime is. It's not more or less dangerous, it's just a shift in the victims, basically, for war. We're seeing fewer soldiers die, but we're also seeing more civilians die from missile blasts, from better bombs, from all of those kinds of things, right? And I want to also be very clear, in the Israel-Hamas war, both sides are, to some extent, targeting civilians, at least from what I've heard. Both sides are looking to target civilians. In the Ukraine-Russia war, while Russia is targeting civilians to some extent, Ukraine kind of is, not really, but again, the nature of war is shifting. They're targeting civilians for morale reasons, for fear reasons. Whereas there was less civilian targeting in the world wars, right? Because once you beat an army of a nation, you really didn't have to worry about the local civilians. Sometimes you would. Obviously, there would be some people who would put up a resistance. I think there was some resistance in Paris even after the Germans moved in, which obviously generated civilian casualties. But there weren't that many, right? Whereas with Ukraine, for instance, a lot of people resisted in their own ways, which shifts how civilian casualties are qualified as well. And again, you have to keep in mind that what qualifies as a civilian depends on whether or not you interpret somebody resisting after invasion as a civilian or not, right? Ukraine is a great example of this. Do you consider the people resisting the Russians who aren't part of the Ukrainian military, do you consider them civilians, or do you consider them resistance fighters? Because that's going to change how you represent those stats. All right? Functionally, in war there are no heroes. There is no good side, really. Both sides will commit war crimes at this point. It just matters. What matters is your publicity. Your military publicity department, really. Which is why generally I don't take sides in military conflicts. I even with the two that I've mentioned here, I don't have a side. I don't consider one side any better or worse than the other side. I equate them as roughly equal. But again, the point here, since I'm wandering off the point a little bit here, the point is that the world isn't getting more dangerous, but it's also not getting safer. It's evolving. The danger level of the world, so to speak, is the same. And I'm not saying this to spread fear or anything like that, because as I've stated a couple of times, it's not getting more dangerous. But I want you to be aware, there are a lot of people, either because of personal belief or because it's part of their job. But there are a lot of people trying to tell you that, no, things are fine, things are better, things are safer. But that's not really true. They are correct. Things are not getting more dangerous. They are half correct. Things aren't getting worse, depending on what your definition of worse is. But things also aren't getting better. Things are just changing, evolving. And it's something to be aware of. It's something you should absolutely know, right? And that's what I wanted to say here, because I've seen this a bit more and more, given all of the recent conflicts and the talk of crime recently. But yeah, with that being said, that's all I'm going to say on this subject for now. Thank you all very much for listening. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, and have a great 24 hours.